The smell of boiled linen and dried lavender hung thick in the narrow corridor of St. Jude's Parish Infirmary. It was the kind of place where the walls remembered every cough, every prayer whispered at midnight, every soul that had slipped away between one heartbeat and the next. And on this particular Tuesday evening, in the autumn of 1843, those walls were about to witness something far stranger than any fever or broken bone. Genevieve Thorne was on her 14th hour of work. Her apron was stained with iodine, her dark hair pinned back so tightly it pulled at her temples, and her fingers ached from rolling bandages since before the sun had come up. She moved between the cots with the kind of steady calm that only came from years of practice, checking pulses, adjusting pillows, spooning broth into the mouths of patients too weak to lift their own heads. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a country physician who had died, owing more in debts than he ever earned in fees. Everything she owned fit inside a single leather trunk tucked beneath her cot in the nurses' quarters, and she had absolutely no reason to believe that her life was about to change in the next quarter of an hour. The commotion started near the front entrance. 2 footmen in deep green livery, the kind of livery that cost more than Genevieve earned in a year, came through the door first, scanning the room with sharp, purposeful eyes. Behind them, a younger man in a fine wool coat entered, supporting an older gentleman by the elbow. The older man was tall despite his years. His silver hair was swept back from a broad forehead, and though his face was drawn and pale, there was a sharpness in his gray eyes that suggested his mind was several steps ahead of everyone else in any room he entered. He leaned on a polished walking stick with one hand and gripped the younger man's arm with the other. "I am perfectly capable of standing," the older man said through gritted teeth. "You collapsed in the middle of supper, grandfather. You are not perfectly capable of anything at the moment." That voice, firm, clipped, carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, belonged to Roderick Ashworth, the Duke of Calenford. He was 28, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell just past his collar and a jawline that looked like it had been carved out of English oak. His expression, as he guided his grandfather toward the nearest empty cot, was caught somewhere between genuine worry and deep irritation. Genevieve reached them before anyone else could. "Set him here, please," she said, already pulling back the thin blanket on the cot nearest the window where the air was freshest. She pressed 2 fingers to the old man's wrist, counting silently while the footman shuffled about looking useless. "His pulse is quick but steady," she said after a moment. "Sir, can you tell me when you last ate a full meal? And have you had water today?" Lord Bartholomew Ashworth, the former Duke, Roderick's grandfather, and by most accounts the sharpest mind in 3 counties, looked up at the young nurse examining him with such practiced efficiency, and let out a quiet breath. "Clever girl," he murmured. "You check the simple things first." "The simple things kill more people than the complicated ones, sir." Something shifted behind his eyes, a spark of recognition, though Genevieve could not imagine what he might be recognizing. They had never met before this moment. Lord Bartholomew allowed her to examine him properly. She checked his breathing, felt the temperature of his forehead, asked him to squeeze her hands to test his grip. While she worked, Roderick stood nearby with his arms folded, watching her with the suspicious attention of a man who trusted very few people and was not about to start now. "It appears to be exhaustion and mild dehydration," Genevieve said at last. "I would recommend rest, clear broth, and a full night's sleep before any travel." "There," Roderick said. "You heard her. We will stay the night and leave at first light." Lord Bartholomew ignored him entirely. His gaze remained fixed on Genevieve. "What is your name, child?" "Genevieve Thorne, sir." "Thorne. He repeated the name slowly, as though tasting it. Daughter of Dr. Edwin Thorne of Barrowmere. Genevieve blinked. You knew my father. I knew of him. A good physician, honest to a fault, which is precisely why he died poor. Lord Bartholomew's voice softened. And I know what you carry in that trunk of yours, Miss Thorne. The color drained from Genevieve's face so quickly that for a moment she looked like she might need a cot herself. Her lips parted, but no words came. Roderick looked between them, frowning. Grandfather, what are you talking about? Lord Bartholomew raised one hand, a gesture so quiet and commanding that it silenced his grandson immediately. Miss Thorne, he said carefully, you have in your possession certain documents that a very dangerous man wants destroyed. As long as those documents exist and you remain unprotected, your life is in considerable danger. Am I correct? Genevieve's hands trembled at her sides. She glanced toward the corridor, toward the other nurses, toward the door, as though expecting someone to come bursting through at any moment. How could you possibly know that? She whispered. Because the man who wants them destroyed has been trying to buy my silence for 3 months, Lord Bartholomew replied. And because I have spent the last fortnight trying to find the one person brave enough to have kept the evidence instead of burning it. He paused. I did not expect to find her here, but Providence has a peculiar sense of timing. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded sheet of heavy parchment, already bearing a wax seal and 2 witness signatures from the footmen who had accompanied him. Roderick stepped forward. What is that? A binding marital contract, Lord Bartholomew said, as calmly as if he were ordering tea. Under the Ashworth family charter and the ecclesiastical authority of this parish, I am exercising my ancestral right to select a bride for the Duke of Calenford. He held the document out toward Genevieve. Miss Thorne, if you sign this paper, you will become the future Duchess of Calenford by legal decree, and more importantly, every item in your possession, including that trunk, will fall under ducal protection beyond the reach of any man who might wish to seize it. The infirmary went completely silent. Even the patients in the nearby cots seemed to hold their breath. Roderick's face had gone from confusion to pure disbelief. You cannot be serious. I have never been more serious about anything in my life, Lord Bartholomew replied, his gray eyes steady. Genevieve stared at the parchment. Her mind was racing. She could feel the weight of every sleepless night she had spent over the past 2 months, every shadow that made her flinch, every locked door she checked twice before closing her eyes. The documents hidden in her trunk could bring down one of the most powerful trade lords in England. And that same trade lord had already sent men looking for her twice. She picked up the pen from the bedside table where she kept her patient notes, and she signed. Roderick watched in stunned silence as his grandfather countersigned the document, folded it neatly, and tucked it back inside his coat. Congratulations, my boy, Lord Bartholomew said, settling back against the pillow with the faintest trace of a smile. You are now engaged to the bravest woman in England. I suggest you start acting like you deserve her. The carriage ride from St. Jude's to Calenford Manor took just under 3 hours through the fog-wrapped countryside of southern England. Genevieve spent most of it clutching her leather trunk on her lap and staring out the window at passing hedgerows she could barely see through the morning mist. Lord Bartholomew slept across from her, propped against the padded wall of the carriage with his walking stick resting between his knees. He snored lightly, and in sleep his face looked gentler, more like a tired old man and less like someone who had just rearranged 3 lives over the course of 5 minutes. Roderick rode outside on horseback. He had refused to sit in the carriage. Genevieve had heard him tell one of the footmen that the morning air would do him good, but she understood the real reason. He could not bring himself to share an enclosed space with the woman his grandfather had just thrust upon him. She did not blame him. When the carriage finally turned off the main road and passed through a pair of tall iron gates flanked by stone pillars, Genevieve leaned forward and caught her first glimpse of Calenford Manor. The house rose out of the mist like something from a painting she might have seen once in a gallery she could never afford to enter. 3 stories of pale limestone, tall windows catching the weak morning sun, ivy climbing the eastern wall in thick green ropes. The grounds stretched in every direction, manicured lawns giving way to orchards, then woodland, then the gray line of the hills beyond. She had treated lords and merchants, and once even a baronet's wife at St. Jude's. She had read about estates like this in penny journals during her supper breaks. But standing in front of one with a signed marital contract folded inside her apron pocket was something else entirely. A housekeeper named Mrs. Calloway met them at the front steps. She was a stout woman in her 50s, with steel-colored hair pinned beneath a starched cap, and she looked at Genevieve the way one might look at a stray cat that had wandered into a formal dining room. "The East guest chamber has been prepared," Mrs. Calloway said, addressing Roderick rather than Genevieve. "Shall I have a tray sent up for the young lady?" "She is not a guest," Lord Bartholomew said from behind them, descending the carriage steps with the help of a footman. "She is the future Duchess of Calenford. Kindly address her accordingly." Mrs. Calloway's eyebrows rose approximately half an inch, a seismic display of emotion for a woman of her profession, and she turned to Genevieve with a stiff curtsy. "My apologies, Miss Thorne. Welcome to Calenford." Genevieve managed a small nod. Her throat felt too tight for words. Roderick said nothing. He handed his horse's reins to a stable boy, climbed the front steps 2 at a time, and disappeared into the house. The East guest chamber was larger than the entire nurses' quarters at St. Jude's. There was a 4-poster bed with embroidered curtains, a writing desk near the window, a wardrobe that could have housed a small family, and a fireplace where a coal fire had already been lit against the October chill. Genevieve set her trunk down at the foot of the bed and stood in the middle of the room, feeling very small and very out of place. She allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to feel overwhelmed. Then she unpinned her hair, washed her face in the basin on the dresser, and sat down to think. The thinking did not last long, because raised voices began filtering up through the floorboards from the study below. Roderick's voice came first, sharp and carrying. "You had no right." "I had every right," Lord Bartholomew replied. "The family charter grants the elder patriarch. I know what the charter grants. That is a technicality from the last century, meant for arranging alliances between noble families. You used it to bind me to a parish nurse I have never met. I used it to protect a woman who would likely be dead within the month if I had not." A pause. Genevieve pressed her hands together in her lap and listened. "Explain," Roderick said. His voice had dropped lower, and there was something different in it now. The anger was still there, but underneath it, she could hear the first thin thread of concern. Lord Bartholomew spoke more quietly, and Genevieve had to strain to catch the words. 3 months ago, I received a letter from an associate in the Apothecaries' Guild. He had uncovered evidence that Lord Gideon Cross, yes, that Lord Cross, the one who sits on the Trade Council and dines with half the peerage, has been running a counterfeit medicine operation through his shipping network. Diluted tinctures, falsified ingredient lists, adulterated tonics sold at full price to apothecaries across the southern counties. People have fallen ill, some have died. And the girl? Miss Thorne's father was one of the physicians who first noticed the pattern. He kept records, purchase receipts, batch numbers, correspondence with the suppliers. When he died, the records passed to his daughter. She has been carrying them with her for months, too frightened to go to the magistrate because Cross owns half the magistrates in this county, and too principled to destroy them because she knows they are the only proof that exists. Another pause. Longer this time. Why the marriage contract? Roderick asked. Why not simply bring her here, under your protection, as a household guest? Because a guest can be removed. A guest's belongings can be searched under a magistrate's warrant. A warrant that Cross could obtain by breakfast if he wished. But the personal property of a duchess falls under ducal privilege. No external authority may search, seize, or even inspect it without the duke's direct written consent. Those ledgers become untouchable the moment the marriage is formalized. Genevieve heard a chair scrape against the floor. Roderick was pacing. You might have told me before you signed the paper. You would have argued. You would have asked for time to consider, and while you were considering, Lord Cross's men would have found her. You do not know that. I know that 2 of his hired men visited St. Jude's last week, asking after a nurse named Thorne. The ward matron turned them away, but they will return, likely before the end of this week. Silence settled over the study like a held breath. When Roderick spoke again, the anger had faded. What remained sounded closer to exhaustion. What do you expect me to do now? Protect her, Lord Bartholomew said simply. Keep those documents safe, and when the time comes, help her bring them before the right authority, one that Cross cannot buy. And the marriage? One matter at a time, my boy. Genevieve heard footsteps cross the study floor, then the creak of the door opening. She sat perfectly still on the edge of the bed, hands folded, heart hammering. A minute later, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Roderick standing in the corridor. His expression was unreadable, jaw tight, eyes searching her face, as though looking for something he was not sure he wanted to find. Breakfast will be served in the morning room in 20 minutes, he said. Mrs. Calloway will show you the way. He turned to leave, then stopped. Those documents your father kept, he said, without looking back. How many people has Cross harmed? Dozens that we know of, Genevieve said quietly. Possibly hundreds. Roderick stood still for a long moment. Then he gave a single nod and walked away down the corridor, his boots echoing against the polished oak floor. 2 days passed at Calenford Manor in a state of careful, uncomfortable quiet. Genevieve kept mostly to her room and the small garden behind the kitchen wing, reading borrowed books and helping Mrs. Calloway organize the linen stores, partly to keep herself useful, and partly because sitting idle made her feel like she was waiting for something terrible to happen. Roderick spent his time in the study with Lord Bartholomew, going through correspondence and consulting maps of the county. Genevieve saw him at meals, where he was polite in the way a man might be polite to a distant cousin visiting from abroad, courteous, measured, and entirely guarded. He asked her to pass the salt. He inquired once about whether her room was comfortable. He did not ask about the documents again. On the morning of the 4th day, Lord Bartholomew summoned them both to the study. The marital contract is binding, he said, standing by the fireplace with a cup of tea balanced on his palm. But it must be entered into the county registry within 10 days of signing, or it lapses. That means one of you needs to travel to the registrar's office in Oakhaven and file the papers in person. I will go alone, Roderick said immediately. The registrar requires both parties to present themselves for identity confirmation. It is a formality, but the clerk will not process the filing without it. Roderick looked at Genevieve. She met his eyes steadily. I am not afraid of a carriage ride, she said. It is not the carriage ride that concerns me. Then we go quickly, file the papers, and return before anyone knows we have left the estate." Lord Bartholomew nodded approvingly. "Take the covered brougham, rather than the family coach. It draws less attention. And take the Blackwood Forest Road. It is longer, but it avoids the main turnpike, where Cross's men have been seen asking questions at the coaching inns." They departed just after noon, under a gray sky that threatened rain, but never quite delivered. Roderick drove the brougham himself, having dismissed the coachman with instructions to tell anyone who asked that the Duke was indoors with a headache. Genevieve sat inside with her trunk beside her, the curtains drawn halfway so she could watch the road without being easily seen from outside. The Blackwood Forest Road was narrow and winding, cutting through dense stretches of beech and oak that pressed in close on both sides. The leaves had turned copper and gold with the season, and in different circumstances, Genevieve might have found it beautiful. Instead, she found herself watching the shadows between the trees and listening for hoofbeats beneath the steady clatter of their own wheels. They were perhaps 6 miles from Oakhaven when the first rider appeared. He came from a side track, a man on a chestnut horse, dressed in a long dark coat with a scarf pulled up over the lower half of his face. He fell into pace behind the broom at a distance of about 40 yards. Genevieve leaned forward and knocked twice on the partition behind the driver's seat. "There is someone following us." "I see him," Roderick called back. "Hold steady." A minute later, 2 more riders emerged from the tree line ahead, positioning themselves across the road at a narrow point where the forest pressed close and the verge dropped away into a shallow ditch on either side. They carried no weapons that Genevieve could see, but they were large men on strong horses, and they sat in their saddles with the easy confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted through sheer physical presence. Roderick pulled the brougham to a halt. "Good afternoon, sir," the lead rider said, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Forgive the inconvenience. We have been instructed to inspect the luggage of all carriages passing through this stretch today. A matter of stolen property, you understand." "Instructed by whom?" Roderick's voice carried the particular coldness of a man who knew exactly by whom. "A concerned party, sir. It will only take a moment, if you would step down and open the rear compartment." "I am the Duke of Calenford." Roderick did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "And you are obstructing a public road without legal authority. I suggest you move aside." The lead rider exchanged a glance with his companion. The third rider, the one who had been following, moved closer from behind. Genevieve could hear his horse snorting just beyond the rear wall of the brougham. "With all respect, Your Grace," the lead rider said, and the word grace came out with a thin coat of mockery. "Our instructions are very specific. We are to examine any luggage belonging to a young woman traveling in this direction. If there is no young woman in your carriage, then you have nothing to worry about, and we will be on our way." Genevieve's hand tightened around the handle of her trunk. Through the partition, she heard Roderick speak, quietly, as though talking to the horses. "When I say go, brace yourself against the seat." She barely had time to grip the edge of the bench before Roderick snapped the reins hard. The horses surged forward with a startled lurch, and the brougham shot straight toward the gap between the 2 riders. The lead rider's horse reared sideways in surprise, its flank scraping the edge of the carriage with a sound like tearing canvas. The second rider grabbed for the brougham door, but missed, his fingers catching only air as the vehicle rushed past. Genevieve was thrown sideways. Her trunk slid across the floor and struck the opposite wall. She hauled herself upright and looked back through the rear window. All 3 riders were turning their horses, kicking hard to give chase. The brougham was fast on the straight, but the forest road curved sharply ahead, and the riders knew this terrain better than Roderick did. Within a minute, The lead rider had closed the gap to 20 yards. Then Roderick did something unexpected. Instead of following the road around the next bend, he pulled the horses hard to the left, off the road entirely, and down a grassy track that Genevieve had not even noticed. The brougham bounced violently over the uneven ground, branches scraping the roof and sides. Genevieve held on with both hands, her teeth rattling. The track opened suddenly onto a wider farm lane that ran parallel to the main road. Roderick turned the horses south and drove hard for a full mile before slowing. When Genevieve looked back again, the road behind them was empty. They reached Oak Haven by a different route, arriving at the registrar's office just before closing. Roderick filed the papers himself, standing at the clerk's desk with mud on his boots and a tear in the shoulder of his coat, where a branch had caught it during their escape. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, glanced between the Duke and the plainly dressed young woman beside him, but said nothing beyond what was required. The papers were stamped, signed, and entered into the county record. On the ride back to Calenford, by yet another route, Roderick was quiet for a long time. Then, without turning around, he spoke through the partition. "Are you injured?" "I am perfectly well," Genevieve said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Good." A pause. "You did not panic." "I have worked night shifts in a parish infirmary for 4 years, Your Grace. I have had drunken men twice my size throw furniture at me. 3 riders on a forest road are not the worst odds I have faced." She heard something then that she had not heard from Roderick before. A short, surprised breath that might have been the beginning of a laugh, caught and swallowed before it could fully escape. He said nothing else for the rest of the journey. But when they arrived at Calenford and he came around to open the carriage door, he offered her his hand to help her down. It was the first time he had touched her willingly since the night they met. Lord Bartholomew was waiting for them in the entrance hall when they returned from Oakhaven. One look at Roderick's torn coat and the mud splattered across the brougham's wheels told him everything he needed to know. "Cross moved faster than I expected," he said, lowering himself into a chair by the hall fire. "He has people watching the roads. 3 riders in Blackwood Forest," Roderick confirmed. "They wanted the trunk." Lord Bartholomew pressed his lips together and stared into the flames for a long moment. Then he turned to Genevieve, who stood by the staircase with her trunk still held against her chest like a shield. "Miss Thorne, you and Roderick must leave Calenford tonight." Genevieve felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. "Leave? But I thought the estate was safe. The ducal privilege. The privilege protects your belongings from legal seizure. It does nothing against a man who sends hired riders to drag a trunk off a moving carriage in the middle of a forest." Lord Bartholomew's voice was calm, but his knuckles were white where they gripped the arm of his chair. "Cross knows you are here. If he cannot take the documents through the courts, he will try other methods. You need to be somewhere he is not looking." Roderick had already begun pulling off his muddy gloves. "Where?" "Highcliffe. The coastal villa. It has been shuttered since your grandmother's passing, and the deed is recorded under her maiden name, Waverley. Cross would have no reason to connect it to the Ashworth family, unless he went digging through parish records from 40 years ago." Within the hour, Roderick and Genevieve were in a different carriage, a plain hired coach with no family crest on the doors, heading east toward the coast. Lord Bartholomew remained behind at Calenford, promising to send word through a trusted courier if anything changed. They arrived at Highcliffe well past midnight. The villa sat on a chalk bluff overlooking a stretch of dark, restless sea. It was smaller than Calenford, perhaps a dozen rooms in all, with whitewashed walls and shuttered windows that rattled faintly in the salt wind. The caretaker, an elderly fisherman's widow named Mrs. Penny, had received Lord Bartholomew's advance message by local post and had prepared 2 rooms, lit the kitchen stove, and left a cold supper of bread, cheese, and pickled herring on the table. Genevieve ate standing at the kitchen counter because she was too tired to carry herself to a proper chair. Roderick ate nothing. He walked through every room in the house, checking window latches and door locks, before finally settling in the parlor with a glass of brandy and the grim expression of a man running calculations he did not like the answers to. It was past 1 in the morning when Genevieve came downstairs. She had changed out of her travel clothes into a plain gray dress, one of only 3 she owned, and carried her leather trunk in both hands. She set it down on the parlor table in front of Roderick without a word, undid the brass clasps, and opened the lid. Inside, beneath a folded wool shawl and a small sewing kit, were the documents. There were more of them than Roderick had expected. Dozens of loose pages, some yellowed with age, some newer, all covered in tight, careful handwriting. There were also several bound notebooks, a stack of receipts held together with twine, and a small cloth pouch containing what appeared to be fragments of broken wax seals. My father started collecting these about 2 years before he died, Genevieve said, pulling a chair up to the table. He was the attending physician for 3 villages near Barrowmere. Over the course of a single winter, he treated 11 patients for the same symptoms: stomach pains, trembling hands, discoloration of the gums. All of them had been taking the same tonic, sold through the same apothecary. She opened one of the notebooks and turned it so Roderick could read the entries. The handwriting was meticulous: dates, patient names, symptoms, dosages, all recorded with the precision of a man who understood that details mattered. He wrote to the apothecary asking for the supplier's name. The apothecary gave him a bill of sale. She pulled a creased receipt from the stack. The tonic was listed as containing extract of willow bark, camphor, and spirit of hartshorn. My father tested a remaining bottle himself, using a simple acid separation. The willow bark had been diluted to less than a quarter of the listed concentration. The camphor was replaced almost entirely with a cheaper oil, turpentine most likely, and the hartshorn contained traces of lead. Roderick set down his glass. Lead. Enough to cause chronic poisoning over several weeks of regular use. 3 of my father's patients suffered permanent tremors. One, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hadwell, lost her sight in one eye. She laid out 4 more receipts, each from a different apothecary, in a different village. All carried the same supplier's mark, a stamped crest showing a merchant ship above the initials GC. Gideon Cross, Roderick said quietly. His trading company, Cross and Hartwell Maritime, imports raw materials from the continent and supplies apothecaries across the southern counties. My father traced the adulterated batches back through 3 separate shipping routes. Every single one led to the same warehouse in Oakhaven, leased under Cross's name. She opened the cloth pouch and shook the wax seal fragments onto the table. Even broken, the impression was clear, the same ship and initials crest that appeared on the receipts. These were taken from sealed crates at the Oakhaven docks by a warehouse clerk who owed my father a favor. They match the supplier stamps on every falsified receipt. Roderick picked up one of the seal fragments and held it close to the lamplight. His jaw tightened in a way that Genevieve was beginning to recognize, a quiet, contained fury that showed itself in small physical details rather than raised voices. Your father gathered all of this alone? He tried to bring it to the local magistrate in Barrowmere. The magistrate told him there was insufficient evidence and suggested he was mistaken about his own chemical analysis. 2 weeks later, the magistrate's wife was seen wearing a new pearl brooch that my father estimated would have cost £60. Genevieve's voice remained steady, but her hands in her lap had curled into fists. After that, he kept collecting evidence quietly. He believed that if he could gather enough to present before a body that Cross could not influence, it would be impossible to dismiss. And then he died, a riding accident. His horse threw him on a wet road outside Barrowmere. He struck his head on a stone wall. She paused. The coroner ruled it accidental. My father had ridden that road every week for 15 years and never once had trouble with his horse. The implication hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. Roderick was quiet for a long time. He studied the documents spread across the table, the notebooks, the receipts, the broken seals, and Genevieve watched his face shift through something she had not expected to see. He looked past the inconvenience of the betrothal, past the disruption to his orderly life, past his frustration with his grandfather's meddling, and what settled in his expression was a deep, hard-edged respect. "Your father was a brave man," he said. "He was a good physician. He believed that if medicine could not be trusted, then nothing could. And you kept all of this, carried it with you for months, knowing that Cross would come looking for it. I made a promise to my father before he died. He asked me to see it through." She met Roderick's eyes without flinching. "I intend to keep that promise, Your Grace, with or without your help." Roderick held her gaze for a long moment. Then he gathered the documents carefully, placed them back inside the trunk, and closed the lid. "You will have my help, Miss Thorne," he said, "and you may as well start calling me Roderick. If we are to bring down a trade lord together, formality seems rather beside the point." It was the first time she smiled in his presence. Small, brief, gone, almost as soon as it appeared, but real, he noticed. 2 days at the coastal villa passed in a rhythm that felt almost domestic, which unsettled Genevieve more than she cared to admit. Mrs. Penny cooked their meals and kept the fires burning. Roderick spent his mornings reviewing the documents from the trunk, copying key entries into a separate notebook in his own hand. "A precaution," he said, "in case anything happened to the originals." Genevieve helped him cross-reference the supplier receipts against her father's patient records, matching dates and batch numbers, until the pattern of Cross's operation became impossible to deny. They spoke more easily now. Roderick still carried himself with the particular stiffness of a man unused to sharing his space, but the hostility had drained out of him somewhere between Blackwood Forest and the parlor table at midnight. He asked questions about her father's medical practice, about the chemical tests used to identify adulterated compounds, about the way apothecary supply chains worked at the village level. He listened carefully to every answer, and Genevieve discovered that beneath the aristocratic reserve there was a mind that moved quickly and missed very little. On the morning of the 7th day, Mrs. Penny arrived at the kitchen door, looking troubled. "Begging your pardon, Miss Thorne," she said, wringing her hands in her apron. "But I wondered, the village folk say you are a trained nurse. Is that true?" Genevieve set down her teacup. "It is. Is someone unwell? Old Martha Cobb. She is the weaver who lives at the end of the harbor lane. Been there 40 years, longer than most of us. She took poorly 3 days ago. Terrible cough, burning fever, and her hands have seized up so badly she cannot hold a spoon. The nearest physician is in Whitstable, 12 miles off, and Martha will not hear of being moved. Has anyone sent for the physician to come here?" Mrs. Penny shook her head. "His fee is 2 shillings, for a house call outside the town limits. Martha has not earned 2 shillings in a month. The fishing families have been looking after her as best they can, but the fever is getting worse. Genevieve was already on her feet. She turned to Roderick, who sat at the far end of the kitchen table with a cup of black tea and one of her father's notebooks open in front of him. "I need to go into the village." He looked up. "That is unwise. We are supposed to be staying hidden. A woman is ill, and there is no one else to help her. I am not going to sit here behind shuttered windows while someone suffers a quarter of a mile down the road." Roderick studied her face. Whatever he saw there told him that arguing would be a waste of breath. "Then, I am coming with you." They walked down the chalk path that wound from the bluff to the village below, a small cluster of stone cottages huddled around a harbor, where fishing boats rocked gently against their moorings. The air smelled of salt and tar and drying nets. A few villagers looked up from their work as Roderick and Genevieve passed, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and the polite wariness that country people reserved for strangers. Martha Cobb's cottage was the last one on the lane, a squat building with a thatched roof and a front door so low that Roderick had to duck his head to enter. Inside, the single room was warm and dim, heated by a peat fire that smoldered in a stone hearth. A loom stood against one wall, its threads hanging slack and untouched. And in the narrow bed beneath the window, propped up on a pile of mismatched cushions, lay Martha herself. She was perhaps 70, though illness had aged her further. Her skin had a grayish pallor, and her breathing came in short, wet rattles that Genevieve could hear from the doorway. Her hands, the hands of a woman who had spent a lifetime working thread and wool, were swollen at the joints, the fingers curled inward like claws. "Who is this, then?" Martha croaked, squinting at the two figures in her doorway. "My name is Genevieve. I am a nurse. Mrs. Penny asked me to look in on you." "I did not send for any nurse." "I know, but I am here anyway, and I have walked all the way down that dreadful chalk path, so you might as well let me have a look at you before I have to walk back up it." A ghost of a smile crossed Martha's cracked lips. "Cheeky thing. Come on, then." Genevieve knelt beside the bed and went to work with the calm efficiency that came as naturally to her as breathing. She felt Martha's forehead, checked her pulse, listened to her chest by pressing her ear against the old woman's back, and examined her swollen hands with gentle, practiced fingers. Roderick stood near the door, watching. He had seen physicians before. His family's personal doctor was a man named Dr. Hewitt, who arrived in a fine carriage, prescribed expensive tonics, and departed within 20 minutes. What he had never seen was someone practice medicine the way Genevieve did. She spoke to Martha constantly while she worked, a low, steady stream of conversation that had nothing to do with illness. She asked about the loom, about what patterns Martha liked to weave, about whether the harbor had good fishing this season. And Martha, who according to Mrs. Penny had been refusing food and turning visitors away for 2 days, began to talk. Her voice was thin and raspy, but the words came, and with them came a gradual loosening of the tension in her face and shoulders. "The cough is a chest infection," Genevieve said after her examination. "Quite common this time of year, especially in damp cottages near the water. The swelling in your hands is from the joint disease. You have had it a long time, yes? 20 years or more? Some days are tolerable. Lately, every day is a bad one. I can make a poultice for your chest that will help draw out the congestion. And for your hands, I need warm water, cloth wrappings, and if anyone in the village keeps bees, a small amount of melted beeswax mixed with dried lavender. It will not cure the swelling, but it will ease the stiffness enough for you to hold a cup and feed yourself." She turned to Mrs. Penny, who had followed them down and stood hovering outside the door. Within 15 minutes, the village women had gathered everything Genevieve needed. She worked at Martha's small kitchen table, grinding dried herbs with the back of a spoon, heating water over the peat fire, tearing clean cloth into strips with quick, sure hands. Roderick found himself standing in the corner of a fisherman's widow's cottage, the Duke of Calenford with mud on his boots and nothing useful to do, watching a young woman in a plain gray dress save an old weaver's life with beeswax and lavender. Martha fell asleep within the hour, her breathing already steadier, the poultice wrapped snugly around her chest. Genevieve left instructions with Mrs. Penny for changing the wrapping twice daily and promised to return the following morning to check on her progress. On the walk back up the chalk path, Roderick was unusually quiet. The wind off the sea pulled at their coats, carrying the sharp smell of autumn and salt spray. Halfway up, he stopped and turned to Genevieve. "You did not hesitate," he said. "About what?" "Going down there. You heard that someone was ill and you simply went. You did not weigh the risks or calculate whether it was worth the trouble." Genevieve pushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "That is what nurses do, Roderick. When someone is suffering and you have the ability to help, you help. There is no calculation involved." He looked at her for a long moment, standing on a chalk path above the sea, the wind pulling at her skirt, her hands still faintly stained with the greenish residue of crushed herbs. She looked nothing like the women he had been introduced to at London balls and country house weekends. She owned 3 dresses. She carried her entire life in a single trunk. She had no fortune, no title, no connections worth mentioning in polite company. And she had just walked into a stranger's cottage and eased her pain with the kind of quiet, unshakable compassion that Roderick was beginning to suspect money could never purchase. "My grandfather was right about you," he said. Genevieve raised an eyebrow. "In what sense?" He did not answer directly. He offered her his arm for the remainder of the steep climb, and this time she took it. The invitation arrived by private messenger on the 8th day. It was printed on thick cream cardstock with gilt edging, addressed to the Duke of Calenford and guest, and requested the pleasure of their company at the autumn gathering hosted by Sir William Featherstone at his estate in the neighboring county. Roderick read it twice, then set it on the breakfast table beside his toast. "Grandfather's doing," he said. "Sir William is one of his oldest friends. He would not have sent this without being asked." Genevieve looked up from her tea. "Why would Lord Bartholomew want us to attend a ball?" "I thought the entire point was to stay out of sight. The entire point was to keep you safe while we built a case against Cross. Grandfather has apparently decided that the next step is to stop hiding and start being seen." He picked up the card again. "If we attend as an engaged couple, publicly, in front of the county's most influential families, it becomes significantly harder for Cross to move against you without drawing attention. A woman who has been formally introduced to society as the future Duchess of Calenford cannot simply vanish without questions being asked. So this is strategy. This is my grandfather playing chess with real people, which is his favorite pastime." Genevieve looked down at her plain gray dress, the same one she had been wearing for 3 days, washed and hung to dry each evening by the kitchen stove. "I have nothing to wear to a ball, Roderick." He studied her expression and seemed to understand that this was not vanity speaking. It was the practical concern of a woman who had spent her adult life in nurses' aprons and borrowed shawls, being asked to walk into a room full of silk and diamonds. "I will speak to Mrs. Penny," he said. Mrs. Penny, it turned out, had a sister in the nearby market town who worked as a seamstress for the local gentry. By late afternoon, a dress had been delivered to the villa, deep blue velvet with a modest neckline and long sleeves, simple by the standards of London fashion, but well made and elegant. There were also gloves, a pair of low-heeled shoes that were only slightly too large, and a small comb set with paste stones that would pass for sapphires at a distance. When Genevieve came downstairs that evening, Roderick was standing in the front hall, adjusting his cuffs. He wore a dark evening coat, white waistcoat, and a cravat tied with the kind of careless precision that suggested either great skill or a very experienced valet. In this case, neither, since he had managed it himself with the help of a hand mirror and mild cursing. He turned when he heard her on the stairs and went still. She had pinned her dark hair up with the comb, leaving a few strands loose around her face. The blue velvet caught the lamplight and gave her skin a warm glow that the gray dress had never managed. She looked, for the first time since he had met her, like she was not bracing herself for something difficult. "Will I do?" she asked, and there was a trace of genuine uncertainty in her voice that caught him off guard. "You will do very well, Miss Thorne." The drive to Featherstone Manor took an hour through the darkening countryside. They arrived to find the house ablaze with candlelight, carriages lining the gravel drive, and the sound of a string quartet drifting from the open windows of the ballroom. Footmen in powdered wigs held lanterns at the entrance, and the hall beyond was thick with the rustle of silk skirts and the low hum of conversation. Genevieve's hand tightened on Roderick's arm as they crossed the threshold. He felt it and placed his own hand briefly over hers, a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone watching, but she understood it immediately. "Stay close. I am here." Sir William Featherstone was a round, red-cheeked man with an enormous white mustache and the cheerful disposition of someone who genuinely enjoyed feeding people. He greeted Roderick with a firm handshake, and Genevieve with a deep bow that she suspected was more generous than her station technically warranted. "Delighted, my dear. Absolutely delighted. Bartholomew has told me a great deal about you. Come in, come in. The lobster patties are exceptional this evening." For the first half hour, things went better than Genevieve had feared. Roderick guided her through the room with the ease of a man who had attended these gatherings since boyhood, introducing her to the people who mattered, and steering her away from those who would ask too many questions. She found that if she spoke little and smiled at the right moments, most people were content to project whatever qualities they wished onto the future Duchess of Calenford. Then Lord Gideon Cross arrived. She recognized him before Roderick did. He entered through a side door, accompanied by a thin, sharp-faced man who appeared to be a personal secretary. Cross was tall, taller than Roderick, with sandy hair graying at the temples and a face that might have been handsome if it were not arranged in an expression of permanent, calculating appraisal. He wore an immaculate black coat and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who believed his wealth made him untouchable. His eyes found Genevieve across the room within 30 seconds. He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "Your Grace." Cross approached them with the leisurely pace of someone who wanted them to watch him coming. "What a pleasant surprise. I had heard you were keeping to the country this season." "Lord Cross." Roderick's voice was level. "I was not aware you had an acquaintance with Sir William." "I have acquaintances everywhere, Your Grace. It is the nature of trade." His gaze shifted to Genevieve. "And this must be the young lady I have been hearing about. Your grandfather's rather unconventional choice for you." "A nurse, I understand." "A remarkably skilled one," Roderick said. "How charming." Cross took a glass of wine from a passing footman without looking at him. I do hope you understand, Miss Thorne, that the circles you are entering can be rather demanding. People talk. Reputations are fragile. A single misstep, a single rumor, can undo a family's standing in a season. The threat was wrapped in velvet, but it was a threat all the same. Genevieve felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her expression composed. Before she could respond, Roderick stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The room around them had already begun to quiet, heads turning, conversations trailing off, as people sensed the particular tension that accompanies a confrontation between powerful men. "Lord Cross," Roderick said, and his voice carried clearly across the ballroom. "Miss Thorne is my betrothed. She will be the Duchess of Calenford before the year is out. Any rumor that touches her name will be treated as a personal offense against my family, and I trust I do not need to explain to you what that means." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the string quartet faltered for a beat before picking up again. Cross's smile remained fixed, but something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation, quick and cold. He inclined his head in a shallow bow that conceded nothing and acknowledged everything. "Naturally, Your Grace, I meant no offense. I was merely offering friendly counsel." He raised his glass. "To the happy couple." He turned and walked away, his secretary trailing behind like a shadow. The room exhaled. Conversations resumed. A woman in pink silk whispered something to her companion behind a fan. Genevieve looked up at Roderick. His jaw was tight, and she could feel the tension in his arm where her hand still rested. "Thank you," she said quietly. "He was testing us, seeing whether we would shrink." "And did we?" Roderick looked down at her, and for the first time since the night they met, she saw something in his expression that went beyond duty or strategy or the grudging respect he had developed over the past week. There was warmth there, careful, guarded, newly arrived, and entirely real. "No," he said, "we did not." They stayed another hour. They danced once, a slow waltz during which Roderick discovered that Genevieve had never been formally taught, but followed his lead with the same quiet adaptability she brought to everything else. And when they left, stepping out into the cool night air, 3 separate guests remarked to Sir William that the Duke's young bride-to-be had the most extraordinary composure they had seen in years. Sir William smiled into his mustache and said nothing. He was, after all, Bartholomew's oldest friend. The morning after the Featherstone ball, a letter arrived from Lord Bartholomew. It was delivered by a boy on a grey pony, who rode up the chalk path at first light, knocked twice on the villa door, handed the sealed envelope to Mrs. Penny, and rode away again without a word. Roderick read it at the kitchen table while Genevieve poured tea. "Grandfather has been making inquiries through his contacts in the Merchant Guild," he said, scanning the tight, slanted handwriting. "He says the ledgers and receipts we have are strong evidence, but a good barrister working for Cross could argue they were forged. What we need is independent corroboration, shipping records from the Guild's own archives that match the dates and cargo descriptions in your father's notes. The Merchant Guild keeps its own records. Every registered trader operating through English ports is required to file cargo manifests with the Guild. Import quantities, declared contents, port of origin, receiving warehouse, all of it logged and stored in the Guild vaults at Oakhaven. If Cross filed manifests that match the dates on your father's receipts, and if the declared contents differ from what was actually delivered, we have proof of fraud from the Guild's own paperwork. Cross cannot claim that was forged." Genevieve set down the teapot. "Can we simply request access to the vaults? The Guild archives are restricted to members and their appointed agents." Grandfather, however, was a founding patron of the Oakhaven Merchant Guild 40 years ago. His name is still carved above the entrance hall. He has written a letter of authorization granting me access as his representative. Roderick folded the letter and tucked it inside his coat. We leave within the hour. They took the hired coach again, arriving in Oakhaven just as the town was beginning to stir. The Guild Hall was an imposing stone building near the harbor, with tall, arched windows and a carved frieze above the main door, depicting merchant ships under full sail. At this early hour, the building was nearly empty. A few clerks arriving for the day, a porter sweeping the front steps, and an elderly archivist named Mr. Tull, who examined Lord Bartholomew's letter of authorization, checked the wax seal 3 times, and finally admitted them through a heavy oak door at the rear of the building. The vaults were underground. A narrow stone staircase led down into a series of long, low-ceilinged rooms, lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelves. Each shelf held rows of leather-bound ledgers and bundles of loose documents tied with colored ribbon, decades of commercial records stretching back to the previous century. The air was cool and dry, faintly scented with the particular mustiness of old paper and binding glue. Cross and Hartwell Maritime, Mr. Tull said, consulting an index book that he pulled from a desk near the entrance. Registered 1829, annual manifests filed under Section 14, shelves 42 through 47. You may examine any documents in situ, but nothing may be removed from the premises. He left them alone with a single oil lamp and the quiet. Genevieve and Roderick worked side by side in the narrow aisle between the shelves, pulling ledgers down one at a time and comparing the entries against the dates in Dr. Thorne's notebooks. It was painstaking work. The manifests were written in the cramped, abbreviated hand of shipping clerks, full of shorthand codes for cargo types and port designations that required constant cross-referencing. After 2 hours, Genevieve found the first match. "Here," she said, her finger pressed against a line in a manifest dated March 1841. A shipment of medicinal compounds arriving at Oakhaven, port from Rotterdam, declared contents: extract of willow bark, camphor crystals, spirit of hartshorn, receiving warehouse, Chandler's Wharf, lot 14. That is the same warehouse listed on the receipt my father obtained from the Barrowmere apothecary. Roderick leaned over her shoulder, comparing the manifest entry to the corresponding page in the notebook. The quantities match as well. 14 crates declared here, 14 crates received at the apothecary, according to your father's record, and the dates align within a week. Which means Cross filed an official manifest with the Guild claiming the shipment contained proper medicinal compounds while simultaneously delivering adulterated goods to the apothecaries. The Guild's own records contradict what was actually in those crates. They kept searching. Over the next 3 hours, they found 11 more matching entries, spanning a period of 2 years. Each one showed the same pattern. Cargo declared as legitimate medicinal supplies through official Guild channels, received at warehouses controlled by Cross's trading company, and distributed to apothecaries across the southern counties. When compared against Dr. Thorne's chemical analysis of the actual products received, the discrepancy was damning. Then Roderick found something else. He had pulled a ledger from a higher shelf, a thinner volume bound in darker leather that seemed to have been misfiled between 2 larger books. Inside, instead of shipping manifests, he found correspondence, letters between the Guild's port inspector and a senior clerk in Cross's company, discussing the expedited clearance of certain shipments that were to bypass the standard inspection process. He was paying the port inspector to wave his cargo through without examination, Roderick said, reading the letters with growing intensity. Look at this. The inspector writes that he requires an additional £10 per shipment for what he calls administrative facilitation. And here is the reply, confirming payment. Genevieve looked at the letters and felt a strange, fierce satisfaction spreading through her chest. Her father had spent years gathering evidence piece by piece, working alone, doubted by everyone around him, and here, in a dusty vault beneath a guild hall, the final pieces were falling together. "We need copies of these," she said. "Mr. Tull said nothing could be removed. Then we copy them by hand. Every relevant entry, every matching date, every letter, in your handwriting and mine, so there are 2 independent transcriptions that can be verified against the originals." They worked through the remainder of the morning. Roderick copied the manifest entries, while Genevieve transcribed the correspondence, both of them writing as quickly as accuracy allowed. The oil lamp burned low and had to be refilled twice. By midday, they had filled an entire notebook with copied records, each entry carefully annotated with the shelf number, ledger volume, and page reference, so that the originals could be located again by any investigating authority. As they climbed the stone staircase back to the main hall, Roderick paused on the top step. He held the notebook in one hand and Dr. Thorne's original ledger in the other, and he looked at Genevieve with an expression she had not seen from him before, something close to quiet triumph. "Your father built the foundation," he said. "We have just built the walls. When we present this before the right authority, Cross will have nowhere to hide." Genevieve nodded. The weight that had been sitting on her shoulders since her father's death felt lighter, still present, still real, but no longer something she carried alone. They stepped out into the midday sun and walked toward the coach. The harbor was busy, with the usual traffic of fishing boats and merchant vessels, the cries of seagulls mixing with the shouts of dock workers and the creak of rigging. Oakhaven felt ordinary, indifferent to the fact that 2 people had just spent the morning assembling the evidence that would bring down one of its most prominent citizens. Roderick opened the coach door and offered his hand. Genevieve took it and climbed inside, settling the notebook on her lap. "How long before we can arrange a hearing?" she asked. "Grandfather will know. The Merchant Guild Council meets quarterly, but an emergency session can be called if a founding patron submits a formal petition. Given what we have found today, I believe he will have that petition written before we reach Highcliffe." The coach pulled away from the guild hall, turning south toward the coast road. Genevieve watched the harbor shrink behind them through the window, the masts of the merchant ships standing tall against the pale autumn sky. Somewhere in this town, Lord Gideon Cross was going about his business, attending to his accounts, dining with his associates, confident that his empire was secure. He had no idea what was coming. The trouble came 2 days after the archive search. Roderick had sent word to Lord Bartholomew through the same courier boy on the grey pony, informing him of the matching manifests and the inspector's correspondence. The reply arrived the following morning. Lord Bartholomew had already begun drafting the formal petition for an emergency session of the Merchant Guild Council. He expected it to be ready within 3 days. 3 days felt manageable. 3 days felt almost safe. Then, on the afternoon of the 13th day, Mrs. Penny came hurrying up from the village with her shawl clutched around her shoulders and her face the color of old chalk. "2 men," she said breathlessly, leaning against the kitchen doorframe, "down at the harbor, asking questions at the tavern, showing a drawing of a young woman, dark hair, slender build, a nurse by profession. They are offering £5 to anyone who can tell them where she is staying." £5 was more than most of the Highcliffe fishermen earned in a month. Loyalty was one thing, but £5 was £5, and Mrs. Penny knew her neighbors well enough to understand that silence had a price. "How long before someone talks?" Roderick asked. Mrs. Penny hesitated. "Before nightfall, I should think. Maybe sooner." Roderick moved quickly. He gathered the notebook of copied records, Dr. Thorne's original ledgers, and the cloth pouch of wax seals, wrapping everything in oilskin and placing it inside a leather satchel. Genevieve packed her trunk in under 5 minutes. She had become efficient at leaving places in a hurry, a skill she wished she had never needed to develop. "We cannot take the coach," Roderick said, scanning the road from the front window. "If they have men at the harbor, they will have someone watching the main road as well. We go on foot along the coastal path." The coastal path was a narrow track that ran along the top of the chalk cliffs, winding northward above the sea. It was used by shepherds and smugglers and very few others, which made it an unlikely route for anyone searching for a duke and his betrothed. The late afternoon light was already fading as they set out, the sun dropping behind a bank of clouds that stretched along the western horizon like a gray curtain being drawn across the sky. They walked for nearly 2 hours. The path rose and fell with the contours of the cliff, sometimes wide enough to walk abreast, sometimes narrowing to a single track where the chalk crumbled away to a sheer drop above the waves. Genevieve kept her eyes forward and her footing steady, though the wind off the sea tugged at her skirts and the sound of the surf far below made her stomach tighten. Roderick walked ahead, the satchel slung across his chest, occasionally stopping to look back along the path behind them. There was no sign of pursuit, but that meant nothing. Cross's men could be approaching from inland, cutting across the fields to intercept them further along the coast. As the last light was fading, they rounded a headland and saw it, the old watchtower. It stood on a promontory above the sea, a squat stone structure perhaps 30 feet tall, built during the wars with France as a signal station for the coastal defenses. It had been abandoned for decades, its wooden door hanging on a single rusted hinge, its narrow windows open to the weather. But the walls were thick, the roof was mostly intact, and from the top floor there was a clear view of the coast path in both directions. Roderick shouldered the door open and checked the interior. The ground floor was bare stone, scattered with old leaves and the remains of a fisherman's fire pit. A wooden ladder, weathered but still solid, led up to the second level, where a plank floor and a partial roof provided some shelter from the wind. "It will do for the night," he said, setting the satchel down against the wall. They had no fire. The smoke would be visible for miles, but Roderick found a pile of dry sacking in one corner that served well enough as insulation against the cold stone floor. Genevieve unpacked the small bundle of food Mrs. Penny had pressed into her hands as they left: half a loaf of bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and 2 apples wrapped in a cloth. They ate sitting side by side against the wall, watching the last band of orange light fade from the horizon through the narrow window. The sea below was a dark, restless expanse, and the stars were beginning to appear overhead, faint at first, then brighter as the sky deepened. "I keep thinking about what my father would say if he could see me now," Genevieve said after a long silence. "Hiding in an abandoned watchtower on a cliff, with a duke, eating cheese in the dark." Roderick pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. "What do you think he would say?" "He would probably ask whether you were a good man. That was always his first question about anyone. Lord or laborer, it made no difference. He believed a person's character was the only thing worth measuring." "And what would you tell him?" Genevieve considered the question carefully. The wind whistled through the gaps in the stonework, carrying the faint cry of seabirds roosting on the cliffs below. "I would tell him that you complained a great deal at first," she said, "that you were stubborn and guarded and far too accustomed to having your own way. And then I would tell him that when it mattered, when the riders came, when Cross threatened me at the ball, when there was evidence to find and danger to face, you stood firm every single time." She paused. "I would tell him, yes, you are a good man." Roderick was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, stripped of the careful formality he wore, like armor. "I have spent most of my adult life managing an estate, attending to duties, fulfilling obligations that were decided for me before I was old enough to understand them. I assumed my marriage would be another obligation, an arrangement made for the benefit of the family name, with a woman chosen from the appropriate circles." He turned his head slightly, looking at her profile in the faint starlight. "My grandfather chose a nurse from a parish infirmary who carries forged trade evidence in a leather trunk, and I am beginning to think he understood something about me that I did not understand about myself, which is that I did not need someone from the appropriate circles. I needed someone who would stand beside me in a watchtower on a cliff and tell me the truth about my own character, without flinching." The words settled between them like something fragile and newly formed. Genevieve felt her heartbeat quicken, and for once, it had nothing to do with fear. She reached over and placed her hand on his where it rested on the cold stone floor. His fingers closed around hers, gently, deliberately, as though making a decision he had been turning over in his mind for days. "Whatever happens at the guild hearing," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I am grateful. For all of it, for your grandfather's madness, for your stubbornness, for this watchtower, and this terrible cheese." He laughed, a real laugh this time, low and warm, the kind of sound she suspected very few people had ever heard from the Duke of Calenford. "When this is finished," he said, "when Cross has been dealt with, and the documents are safe, and the hearing is behind us, I would like to begin again, properly, without contracts and danger and hired riders in the forest." "Begin what again?" He squeezed her hand. "Us." The single word hung in the salt air between them, honest and unguarded. Genevieve leaned her shoulder against his, and they sat together in the quiet dark, watching the stars turn slowly overhead and listening to the sea break against the cliffs far below. Tomorrow would bring the hearing, the confrontation, the final reckoning with a man who had poisoned and cheated and destroyed without consequence for years. Tomorrow would require every ounce of courage and resolve they possessed. But tonight, in an old watchtower on the edge of England, two people who had been strangers 12 days ago sat shoulder to shoulder and knew, with a certainty that neither of them questioned, that they would face whatever came next together. They left the watchtower at first light and walked the remaining 3 miles along the coastal path to a small hamlet called Briar's End, where Roderick hired a cart from a farmer heading to market. The farmer asked no questions. A shilling for the ride bought his silence and his indifference, and by 8:30 in the morning, Roderick and Genevieve were standing outside the Oakhaven Merchant Hall with chalk dust on their shoes and the leather satchel between them. Lord Bartholomew was already there. He stood at the foot of the hall's stone steps, leaning on his walking stick, wearing his finest coat and a look of grim satisfaction. Beside him was a wiry man in a dark suit, carrying a rectangular case under one arm, Mr. Alistair Crane, a barrister from London whom Lord Bartholomew had summoned 3 days earlier and who had travelled through the night by mail coach to arrive in time. "You look dreadful," Lord Bartholomew said, studying his grandson's rumpled coat and the dark circles under Genevieve's eyes. "We spent the night in a watchtower," Roderick replied. "How romantic." "It was freezing, grandfather." Lord Bartholomew waved this aside. "Mr. Crane has reviewed copies of the key documents I forwarded to him by courier. He is satisfied that we have sufficient grounds for a formal complaint before the Guild Council. The emergency session has been granted. The council members began arriving an hour ago." He glanced at Genevieve. "Are you prepared, Miss Thorne?" Genevieve straightened her shoulders. Her dress was creased, her hair was pinned up hastily, and she had eaten nothing since the previous evening's bread and cheese. She looked like exactly what she was, a young woman who had been chased, threatened, and hunted across the countryside for the crime of keeping honest records. "I am prepared," she said. The Merchant Hall's council chamber was a high-ceilinged room, paneled in dark oak, with tall windows that let in the gray morning light. A long curved table dominated one end, behind which sat the 7 members of the Merchant Guild Council, men of middle age and older, prosperous, well-fed, dressed in the sober black coats and high collars that marked them as the commercial authority of the region. At the center sat the Guild Master, a white-haired man named Sir Edwin Poole, whose expression suggested he would rather be anywhere else on a Tuesday morning. The gallery benches along the walls were nearly full. Word of an emergency session had spread quickly, and the merchant community of Oakhaven had turned out in force. Traders, ship owners, warehouse managers, clerks, all watching with the keen attention of people who understood that whatever happened in this room could affect their livelihoods. Lord Gideon Cross sat at the respondents' table to the left of the council bench. He was immaculately dressed, his expression composed, his hands folded on the table in front of him. His sharp-faced secretary sat beside him, along with a thick-set man in a barrister's wig, who Genevieve assumed was Cross's legal counsel. Cross looked at Genevieve as she entered and offered her a thin, pitying smile, the kind of smile a man gives when he believes himself untouchable. Sir Edwin Poole called the session to order with 3 sharp raps of a wooden gavel. "This emergency hearing has been convened at the petition of Lord Bartholomew Ashworth, founding patron of this guild, under Article 9 of the Guild Charter. The complaint is brought against Lord Gideon Cross, principal owner of Cross and Hartwell Maritime, alleging the systematic adulteration and fraudulent sale of medicinal compounds through guild-registered trade channels." He looked over his spectacles at Roderick. "Your Grace, you may present your evidence." Roderick stood. He spoke clearly and without haste, laying out the case in the methodical order he and Genevieve had spent days assembling. He began with Dr. Thorne's original patient records, the 11 cases of poisoning in the villages near Barrowmere, the matching symptoms, the common source. He presented the purchase receipts bearing Cross's trade seal, the chemical analysis showing adulterated ingredients, and the correspondence between the apothecaries and Cross's supplier network. Cross's barrister objected twice during this initial presentation, arguing that the documents were unverified and could have been fabricated. Mr. Crane, speaking on behalf of Lord Bartholomew, countered each objection calmly, noting that the documents were available for independent examination and that their authenticity could be tested against the Guild's own records, which brought Roderick to the second part of the case. He opened the notebook containing the copied Guild manifests, the shipping records he and Genevieve had transcribed in the archive vault 2 days earlier. He read out the matching entries one by one, each manifest date aligned with a corresponding receipt from Dr. Thorne's collection, each declared cargo description contradicted by the chemical evidence of what had actually been delivered. The council chamber grew progressively quieter as he spoke. The gallery spectators leaned forward. 2 of the council members exchanged glances. Sir Edwin Poole removed his spectacles, polished them, and replaced them, a gesture Genevieve suspected he performed when he was absorbing information he found deeply uncomfortable. Then Genevieve stood. She had not planned to speak. The legal presentation was Roderick's role, and Mr. Crane was there to handle procedural matters. But when Roderick finished reading the manifest entries, Sir Edwin turned to her and asked whether she wished to address the council in her capacity as the custodian of Dr. Thorne's records. She walked to the front of the chamber and faced the 7 men behind the curved table. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. My father was a country physician. He earned very little. He owed more than he owned, and he died on a wet road 3 miles from the home where I grew up. He spent the last 2 years of his life documenting what Lord Cross's company was doing to his patients, people who trusted the medicines they purchased and had every right to expect that those medicines would not poison them. She paused. Mrs. Agnes Hadwell of Barrowmere, aged 67, lost the sight in her right eye after taking a tonic contaminated with lead. Mr. Thomas Birch, a carpenter, suffered tremors so severe he could no longer hold his tools and lost his trade. I treated 4 of these patients myself when I joined St. Jude's Parish Infirmary. I watched them suffer from ailments that should never have existed, caused by greed and dishonesty. She turned and looked directly at Cross. He met her gaze with the calm steadiness of a man accustomed to being accused and accustomed to walking free. My father could not bring this evidence forward in his lifetime because the local magistrate had been paid to look away. I carried it with me for months because I had no one to trust and nowhere safe to turn. I am here today because Lord Bartholomew Ashworth and the Duke of Calenford gave me that safety, and I am asking this council to do what the magistrate of Barrowmere would not, to look at this evidence honestly and act upon it. She returned to her seat. The chamber was silent. Cross's barrister rose and delivered a lengthy rebuttal, questioning the chain of custody of the documents, suggesting that Dr. Thorne's chemical analysis was unreliable, and implying that the entire case was motivated by personal grievance rather than genuine concern for public welfare. He spoke well, with the practiced fluency of a man being paid a great deal of money. Then Mr. Crane played his final card. He produced the correspondence Roderick had found misfiled in the guild vault, the letters between Cross's senior clerk and the guild port inspector, detailing payments for bypassing cargo inspections. These were not copies. Mr. Crane had obtained permission from the guild archivist to present the original documents, bearing the original signatures and the guild's own filing stamps. Cross's barrister fell silent. Cross himself looked at the letters on the table, and for the first time since the hearing began, his composure flickered. A muscle twitched at the corner of his jaw. His hands, still folded, tightened against each other. Sir Edwin Poole conferred with his fellow council members in low voices for several minutes. Then he straightened in his chair and addressed the chamber. The evidence presented is substantial and deeply concerning. This council finds sufficient grounds to revoke the trade license of Cross and Hartwell Maritime, effective immediately. All assets held under the company's guild registration are hereby frozen pending a full investigation. The matter will be referred to the Crown's Excise Authority for criminal proceedings. The gallery erupted. Cross rose from his chair, his face rigid, and left the chamber without speaking. His barrister gathered his papers and followed. The sharp-faced secretary was the last to leave, casting a single venomous glance toward Genevieve before disappearing through the side door. Roderick reached over and took Genevieve's hand beneath the table. She held on tightly and did not let go. The 2 days following the guild hearing passed in a blur of paperwork, correspondence, and the particular exhaustion that comes after a long fight finally reaches its conclusion. Lord Gideon Cross's fall was swift and thorough. The Guild Council's ruling stripped his company of its trading license before sundown on the day of the hearing. By the following morning, Crown excise officers had arrived in Oakhaven to begin a formal audit of Cross and Hartwell Maritime's warehouses, shipping records, and financial accounts. The port inspector, named in the correspondence, a man called Jennings, who had spent 8 years waving falsified cargo through customs in exchange for quiet payments, was arrested at his home before breakfast and taken to the county jail. Cross himself attempted to leave England on the evening packet boat to Calais. He was stopped at Dover by excise officers acting on a warrant obtained by Mr. Crane and escorted back to Oakhaven under guard. His assets were frozen, his accounts sealed, and his membership in every gentleman's club and trade society in the southern counties was quietly revoked. Within 48 hours, the man who had dined with half the peerage and bought the silence of magistrates found himself sitting in a rented room above a solicitor's office, waiting for a criminal trial he could no longer afford to defend against. Genevieve learned all of this through letters that arrived at Calenford Manor in a steady stream over the course of 2 days. She read each one at the writing desk in her room, absorbing the details with a strange mixture of relief and something she could only describe as emptiness. The fight that had consumed her life for months, that had shaped every waking moment since her father's death, was over. The evidence had been heard, the guilty had been held to account, and she found herself sitting in a beautiful room, in a beautiful house, with nothing left to carry and no clear sense of what came next. On the afternoon of the 16th day, Roderick knocked on her door. "Come with me," he said. "There is something I would like to show you." She followed him downstairs and through the main hall, past the morning room and the library, along a corridor she had not explored before that led toward the eastern wing of the manor. The corridor ended at a pair of tall glass doors, beyond which lay the conservatory. Genevieve had heard Mrs. Calloway mention the conservatory once, a large glass-roofed structure that Roderick's grandmother had built decades ago for growing orchids and citrus trees. It had fallen into disuse after her passing, and Genevieve had assumed it was simply another empty room in a house full of rooms that a single man had no real need for. Roderick opened the glass doors and stood aside. The conservatory had been transformed. The old plant beds had been cleared and replaced with long wooden work tables. Glass-fronted cabinets lined the walls, already stocked with rows of labeled bottles, tinctures, salves, dried herbs, surgical spirits, bandaging cloth. A copper basin with a hand pump stood in one corner for washing instruments. There were shelves of medical reference books, a set of examining screens for patient privacy, and a writing desk positioned near the windows where the afternoon light fell in clean, bright angles. At the far end of the room, a second door had been fitted, a proper entrance from the outside, with a covered porch and a flagstone path leading around the side of the house to the main drive. Above the door, painted in simple black lettering on a white board, were the words, "Thorne Dispensary, free medical treatment for all." Genevieve stood in the middle of the room and pressed her hand against her mouth. "The building work has been underway since the day after the Featherstone ball," Roderick said, standing a few paces behind her. Grandfather arranged the initial funding, and Mrs. Calloway oversaw the renovations. The cabinets were delivered from a medical supplier in London yesterday morning. The instruments are on order and should arrive by the end of the week. Genevieve walked slowly between the work tables, running her fingertips along the smooth wood surfaces. She opened one of the glass cabinets and examined the bottles inside, each one labeled in a neat, careful hand that she recognized as Mrs. Calloway's. Willow bark extract, camphor oil, lavender tincture, honey and beeswax salve. Every item was genuine, properly prepared, and clearly marked. She stopped at the writing desk and picked up a leather folder that lay open on its surface. Inside were official documents, property deeds, signed and stamped, transferring ownership of the conservatory building and the surrounding quarter-acre of grounds to Miss Genevieve Thorne, to be operated as a public medical dispensary under the patronage of the Calenford estate. The deeds were accompanied by a letter of endowment guaranteeing annual funding for supplies, maintenance, and the salary of one attending nurse. The attending nurse was listed as Genevieve herself. She put the folder down and turned to face Roderick. He stood near the glass doors with his hands clasped behind his back, watching her with an expression that contained none of his usual guardedness. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, genuinely uncertain. Your father spent his life trying to protect people from exactly the kind of harm Cross inflicted, he said. He deserved to have his name on something permanent, something that would carry his work forward, and you deserve a place where your skills are valued and your purpose is your own. Genevieve opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught somewhere in her chest. She looked around the room again, the cabinets, the work tables, the brass instruments gleaming in the afternoon light, the sign above the door bearing her father's name, and felt the full weight of everything that had happened since that evening at St. Jude's Infirmary pressing against her heart. "Roderick," she managed, and her voice cracked on the second syllable. He crossed the room and stood in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the faint lines of sleeplessness around his eyes and the small cut on his jaw where he had nicked himself shaving that morning. He looked like a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say and then forgotten every word of it. "When my grandfather signed that contract, I believed it was an imposition, a duty forced upon me by an old man who thought he knew better than everyone else." He paused. He did know better. He saw what I was too proud to recognize, that the life I had been living was orderly and correct and entirely incomplete. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small velvet box, dark blue and slightly worn at the corners. Inside, resting on a cushion of ivory silk, was a ring, a single oval sapphire set in a thin gold band, flanked by two small seed pearls. It was delicate and beautiful and clearly very old. "This was my grandmother's," he said. "She wore it every day of her married life, and she told my grandfather once that it reminded her of the sea at Highcliffe in the late afternoon. He kept it after she died and told me I would know when it belonged to someone else." He held the box toward her, and his hand was steady even though his voice was not. "Genevieve, I am not asking you to stay because of a contract. I am not asking you to stay because of duty or obligation or because my grandfather decided our fates over a cot in a parish infirmary. I am asking you to stay because in the 12 days I have known you, you have shown me what courage looks like, what compassion looks like, and what it means to love something, your work, your father's memory, the truth, so completely that you would risk everything to protect it." He met her eyes. "I would like very much to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that, if you will have me." Genevieve looked at the ring, then at the dispensary around her, then at the man standing before her, the Duke of Calenford, who had driven a carriage through a forest to save her trunk, who had held her hand in a watchtower on a cliff, who had stood in front of a room full of powerful men and fought for justice, because a country nurse asked him to. She took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting there for her all along. "Yes," she said, "I will have you, Roderick Ashworth, stubbornness and all." He laughed, that same low, warm sound she had first heard on the cliff path, and pulled her close. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder and breathed in the scent of wool and soap and the faintest trace of salt air that still clung to his coat from Highcliffe. Through the glass roof of the conservatory, the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds and filled the room with golden light, catching the sapphire on her finger and scattering tiny blue reflections across the walls like scattered promises. The morning of the wedding broke clear and cold, with a pale autumn sun hanging low over the Calenford hills and a thin frost silvering the grass along the drive. Mrs. Calloway had been awake since before dawn, directing a small army of household staff through the final preparations with the focused intensity of a general marshalling troops for a campaign she intended to win decisively. The ancestral chapel stood at the western edge of the estate grounds, tucked behind a row of ancient yew trees that had been growing there since before the manor itself was built. It was a modest building by aristocratic standards. Gray stone walls, a slate roof, narrow arched windows fitted with plain glass that let in the light without filtering it through color. The Ashworth family had married, christened, and mourned in this chapel for 5 generations, and its simplicity was a point of quiet pride. No gilt, no marble, no imported ornament, just honest English stone and the smell of old wood and candle wax. Genevieve stood in the east guest chamber, the same room she had been given on her first morning at Calenford, when Mrs. Calloway had looked at her like a stray cat and Lord Bartholomew had corrected her with 3 sharp words. That felt like a lifetime ago, though barely 18 days had passed. The dress laid out on the bed was ivory silk, cut simply with a high waist and long sleeves trimmed with delicate lace at the cuffs. It had arrived the previous afternoon from the same seamstress in the market town who had supplied the blue velvet for the Featherstone ball. Mrs. Calloway had overseen every measurement and fitting personally, and when Genevieve had tried to thank her, the housekeeper had waved her off with a brisk remark about proper standards and walked away before the redness in her eyes became too obvious. Genevieve dressed herself. She had no lady's maid, no mother to help with her buttons, no sister to fuss with her hair. She pinned the dark curls up with the paste-stone comb she had worn to the ball and fastened her grandmother's small silver locket around her neck, the only piece of jewelry she had owned before the sapphire ring that now sat on her left hand. She looked at herself in the mirror above the dresser. The woman who looked back at her was the same woman who had spent 14-hour shifts rolling bandages at St. Jude's, who had eaten cold porridge, standing up, because there was never time to sit down, who had carried a dead man's evidence in a leather trunk across 3 counties, while hired men searched for her in every coaching inn and harbor town along the southern coast. That woman was about to become a duchess. She pressed her hand flat against the mirror glass, fingertips touching fingertips with her own reflection, and took a slow breath. "Well, Father," she said quietly to the empty room, "I kept my promise." A knock came at the door. She expected Mrs. Calloway come to escort her downstairs. Instead, she opened it to find Lord Bartholomew standing in the corridor, dressed in a dark blue coat with a white rose pinned to his lapel. He had trimmed his silver hair and polished his walking stick, and he looked, for the first time since she had met him, entirely at peace. "I wondered," he said, offering his arm, "whether you might allow an old man the honor of walking you to the chapel. I understand it is customary for a father to perform this duty, and since yours cannot be here, I thought perhaps a meddling grandfather might serve as an adequate substitute." Genevieve felt her throat tighten. She placed her hand on his arm and squeezed gently. "There is nothing adequate about you, Lord Bartholomew. You are quite extraordinary." "My dear girl, I have been waiting 81 years for someone to say that. Shall we?" They walked together through the main hall, past the morning room where she had eaten her first awkward breakfast with Roderick, past the study where she had stood listening through the floorboards while grandfather and grandson argued about a contract she had signed with ink-stained fingers. The household staff lined the corridor. Footmen, kitchen maids, the cook, the stable boys, each offering a small bow or curtsy as she passed. Mrs. Calloway stood at the far end, holding open the garden door, and as Genevieve walked past her, the housekeeper reached out and straightened a fold of lace at her sleeve without a word. The path to the chapel wound through the yew trees, their dark branches forming a natural corridor that opened onto the small churchyard. The chapel door stood wide, and inside, the pews were filled with the people of Calenford, estate workers, tenant farmers, the village blacksmith, the local schoolmaster, the apothecary from the nearest town. These were working people, ordinary people, and they had come because in the 18 days since Genevieve Thorne had arrived at the manor, word had spread through the surrounding countryside about the nurse who had brought down a corrupt trade lord and who was building a free dispensary on the estate grounds. Mrs. Penny had made the journey from Highcliffe, wearing her best bonnet. Beside her sat old Martha Cobb, the weaver from the harbor village, whose chest had cleared and whose hands had loosened enough under Genevieve's care that she had woven a small square of cloth as a wedding gift. It lay folded in her lap, white linen with a border of tiny blue flowers, each one stitched with the careful precision of fingers that had been given back their purpose. Roderick stood at the altar with the parish rector, a round-faced clergyman named Reverend Marsh, who had performed every Ashworth ceremony for the past 20 years, and who was perspiring gently into his surplice, despite the cool autumn air. Roderick wore a dark coat, a silver waistcoat, and an expression that Genevieve had never seen on his face before. Open, unguarded, and entirely without reservation. He watched her walk the length of the chapel on his grandfather's arm, and his eyes did not leave her face. Lord Bartholomew delivered Genevieve to the altar, placed her hand in Roderick's, and stepped back to take his seat in the front pew. As he sat down, he drew a handkerchief from his breast pocket, pressed it briefly to his eyes, and tucked it away again with the swift efficiency of a man who had no intention of being seen weeping in public. The ceremony was brief and traditional. Reverend Marsh read from the Book of Common Prayer, his voice carrying clearly through the small stone space. When he reached the vows, Roderick spoke his with a steadiness that surprised even himself. Each word deliberate, each promise made with the full understanding of what it meant to bind his life to the woman standing before him. Genevieve spoke her vows quietly. Her voice did not waver, though her hands trembled slightly in Roderick's grip. She had faced down hired riders, stared into the eyes of a man who wanted her silenced, and stood before a council of powerful merchants to demand justice. Speaking these particular words in this particular place to this particular man required a different kind of courage, the kind that meant letting someone in completely and trusting that they would stay. When Reverend Marsh pronounced them married, a cheer went up from the pews that rattled the plain glass windows and startled a family of sparrows nesting in the chapel eaves. Roderick kissed Genevieve's hand, her right hand first, then her left, where the sapphire ring sat beside the new gold wedding band, and she laughed, the sound bright and unself-conscious and entirely free. The wedding breakfast was held on the south lawn of the manor, where long tables had been set up beneath the trees. Mrs. Calloway had outdone herself. Roasted meats, fresh bread, apple tarts, cheese from the estate dairy, cider pressed from the orchard fruit. The estate workers ate alongside the Duke and his new Duchess, without ceremony or pretense, and Genevieve moved among them with the ease of a woman who had spent her life in the company of ordinary people and saw no reason to stop now. Lord Bartholomew sat at the head of the table, eating very little but watching everything with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose final and most important calculation had proven correct. When Roderick came to sit beside him, the old man placed his hand on his grandson's shoulder. "You chose well, grandfather," Roderick said. "I chose the only woman in England stubborn enough to deserve you." Lord Bartholomew smiled. "The rest was simply a matter of letting you catch up." As the afternoon light stretched long and golden across the grounds of Calenford Manor, Genevieve stood at the edge of the south lawn and looked out over the estate. The orchards, the hills, the glass conservatory where the Thorn dispensary sign hung above the door, the chapel tower rising above the yew trees. Roderick came to stand beside her, and she leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his arm against her shoulder. Somewhere in her old leather trunk, now resting peacefully in the corner of the room she would share with her husband, her father's notebooks lay closed. The evidence they contained had done its work. The people they were meant to protect were safe, and Genevieve Thorn, the poor nurse from St. Jude's Parish Infirmary, the physician's daughter with 3 dresses and a borrowed comb, was exactly where she was meant to be.